Hi everyone, my name is Leah Lopez and I researched poliomyelitis. So poliomyelitis is a highly infectious viral disease and it causes anywhere from mild and non-paralytic to permanently paralytic symptoms. Its formal name is poliomyelitis and its common name is polio, and this originates from polio, the Greek word for gray, and myelon meaning marrow, and this is because more severe cases of poliomyelitis tend to infect the gray matter of the spinal cord. So a little on the taxonomy. Poliomyelitis belongs to the Picornaviridae family, and there are 5 subsets of this, one of which being enteroviruses, to which poliovirus belongs. Enteroviruses are the most common infectious agents among humans, and some of the viruses that fall into this category besides poliovirus are echovirus, rhinovirus, and Coxsackie virus. So polio has been tracked back even to ancient Egyptian times. It's played a very large role in our culture up until its eradication in more recent decades. In 1789, we had our first medical description of polio. In 1908, physicians Karl Lansaner and Erwin Popper hypothesized that polio may be caused by a virus, and we had multiple large epidemics in the meantime. And this was up until we developed our first vaccine in 1955. A little more on the historical perspective. These are famous figures that also suffered from the virus. So a little bit on the structure. Poliovirus has a spherical shape and a 25 to 30 nanometer diameter. So a little bit about the symmetry. Poliovirus has a capsid arranged in icosahedral symmetry. And this capsid is composed of 60 protomers, each made of 4 virion proteins, VP1 through 4. So VP1 through 3 tend to compose the external structure, and VP4 is going to give a little bit more of that internal support. It is a non-envelope virus, and within the capsid is a single-stranded positive RNA. So this is just a little bit of imagery on the virus showing the different components, the different proteins that compose the capsid, and the naked virus within. There are 3 notable strains. Type 1 is the most commonly encountered in nature. PV2 and PV3 are entirely eradicated, while PV1 is still endemic to 2 countries total. Each strain is slightly differentiated by its different capsid, a slightly different capsid protein, and infection or immunization to one serotype does not protect against the other 2 serotypes. It's just a little fear-mongering, but type 1 is not actually, even though it's the only one that's still prevalent, it's not actually something we really have to worry about because of vaccines. So not the best image, but poliovirus is spread through the fecal-oral route. So essentially, polio is going to be mainly transmitted through airborne, contact, or vehicle transmission. So this is going to be when fecal particles contaminate water or food, a water supply, it gets on an inanimate object, and some way or another it gets into the GI tract, and that's where it's going to manifest. Other ways, a host can cough or sneeze infectious particles, and those can get into another person. Historically, the virus has been widespread in regions with high population densities and subpar sanitation systems. So this is where pathogenesis begins. So we're going to cover 4 different phases: alimentary, lymphatic, viremic, and neural phases. So the alimentary phase is when the polio enters the body through the mouth. It's ingested and initially replicates in the gastrointestinal tract and the oropharynx, and I just put a little image right there. So usually there are going to be viral particles within the fecal matter and within the nasal secretions for a few weeks, even in people who are asymptomatic. So poliovirus is very stable at low pHs, which is why it can travel through that stomach acid in the gastrointestinal tract. So the capsid of the poliomyelitis is attracted to the CD155 receptor, aka the poliovirus receptor, and that's expressed mainly on epithelial cells of intestines. So when those 2 bind together, that's going to cause a conformational change and change the hydrophobicity of the virus so that it can insert that viral DNA into the epithelial cell, and then it can hijack the host mechanics, produce its viral particles, and eventually lyse the cell. And that takes us to our next part, but I'm going to that's a little image showing the hijacking and the lysis a little bit. So that takes us to the lymphatic phase. So many viral particles are produced that it causes the infected cell to lyse, and these viral particles go into the feces sometimes, but others go into the interstitium of the digestive tract, which contains interstitial fluids, and these fluids are going to pass through lymphatic vessels, either mesenteric or cervical lymph nodes. Those are going to be in the back of the head and the neck, and they'll travel through those and circulate throughout the body. At this point, there is an immune response going on. So some cases don't progress past this. But that brings us to the viremic phase. So essentially the lymph that passes through the lymph nodes is redistributed into the bloodstream, and this is called viremia, emia meaning in the blood. So the virus is in the blood. 8% of cases get to this point, but it does not affect their central nervous system, and I'll talk a little bit about how it relates to the central nervous system. So essentially the virus gets into the blood and it finds its way to specific target neurons that connect to the spinal cord. So they get in the bloodstream. They'll find these motor neurons, and essentially what they're going to do from there is they will travel up the peripheral motor neurons in retrograde, and this is what we call retrograde axonal transport. So then the virus has access to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, which is when we're talking about the gray matter of the spinal cord. That's where this infection is leading to. So it's traveling up that motor neuron and leading back to the central nervous system, where we can see some infection. So the central nervous system can get invaded there, and at this point, the neurons that are infected die and no longer receive messages from the brain. And with enough of this cell death, that can lead to loss of muscle function, muscle atrophy, muscle weakness, and paralysis. But the hope is that the antibody response is enough to fight off the disease so that those motor neurons don't get that damaged. So that brings us to the neural phase. So polio tends to infect those motor neurons, and those neurons that are infected die and will no longer receive messages from the brain, like I said, and that will result in that loss of muscle function. So in certain cases, polio can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it will infect the bulbar part of the brain, which controls speaking, swallowing, breathing, and that's when the diaphragm gets affected and people lose their ability to breathe, and that results in death. So this is not necessarily, so this is like, that would be the point of paralysis or fatality, but earlier parts might not necessarily be the point of paralysis or fatality. So this is just a little bit on viremia. You can see the cell lysing and polioviruses, viral particles being released into the bloodstream. This is just a little thing to show the bulbar region, and this is where the poliovirus would infect and affect would essentially damage breathing, swallowing, speaking. And you can see the central nervous system, which is going to affect that muscle function, and also the nerve cells. So then we can kind of look at immune response. I forgot to put IgG antibodies on here, but that is a very important part of the immune response. So in the innate immune response, non-specific responses are going to occur. So that'll be like neutrophils and macrophages that attack foreigners. That's going to cause inflammation that can damage motor nerves. There's also the adaptive immune response, which produces antibodies during the infection, and that'll effectively fight the infection at those different stages. That can be viremia or like while it's in the gastrointestinal tract. But essentially, that's when you're going to get IgA antibodies produced, IgM antibodies produced, and those will be present in the stool. And then also CD4 plus cells are also present in vaccinated individuals. But IgG is a very important antibody that also participates in this process. So an important part of this are the symptoms. So poliomyelitis presents in stages. There's acute stage, recovery stage, and residual paralysis stage. So acute stage is comprised of many features. So that's going to be fever, neck stiffness, profound muscular weakness, autonomic dysfunction, whereas in that recovery stage, that's when the acute features are going to kind of subside, and the recovery of paralyzed muscles begins, and then there can be some residual paralysis, and that comes from like damaged nerves, essentially. Clinical features: 3 to 6 days for non-paralytic incubation period. For non-paralytic poliomyelitis, 7 to 21 days for the onset of paralysis in paralytic myelitis. And that's just a graph explaining some of the timelines. So then we can kind of get into the different types of poliomyelitis. So 90% of people who get polio actually are going to be asymptomatic, but their fecal matter, their sneezes, their coughs, those are all going to be a vehicle for disease, and that can spread. 8 people get abortive poliomyelitis, so that's when the virus doesn't make it past to like a paralytic or get to a paralytic or fatal stage. So this is essentially a mild viremic phase, and there are going to be like flu-like illness, mild respiratory tract infections. These will usually subside within a week. About 1% of people, the central nervous system will be infected, but this might not get to the point of killing motor neurons enough to cause paralysis. But it would cause like meningitis-like symptoms, stiffness in the neck, muscle weakness, things like that. So this paralysis, so then that brings us to the last type, which is paralytic poliovirus, and that's going to occur in 1%, less than 1% of cases. So you have to be very, very unlucky to get that. And if you get paralytic poliomyelitis, that can happen in any part of the body. That can be legs, arms, and like we were saying, when the bulbar region gets infected, that can affect the diaphragm, breathing, and cause death, essentially. So up there shows some of the muscles that are weakened, some of the symptoms, and what a real-life example of that looks like. We wouldn't call any of these symptoms past subclinical, or we wouldn't call anything less than subclinical acute. So basically anything asymptomatic, we don't call that acute. But everything after, we would call that acute poliomyelitis. Just an interesting fact, about 50% of people whose bulbar region are infected, who have bulbar polio, are going to have a 50% mortality rate. Another thing to note that I didn't mention in my slides is there is also like residual, like late stage polio, essentially like later in life, you might see like residual paralysis, and that comes from like motor neuron pathways being affected. But that's another way poliomyelitis can affect the body. So diagnosis is simple. That can be like a feces sample, a throat swab. That can also be cerebrospinal fluid that's taken, and essentially you just culture to reveal viral presence. And even though there's no way to treat poliovirus, once it's gone, we have lots of ways to prevent it. Our main goal with treatment is just to provide as much care and attention to ease the symptoms of patients, but we don't really have a cure for it. We do have prevention methods, though. So humans are the only hosts of poliovirus. Dr. Jonas Salk invented the inactivated polio vaccine in 1954, and that saved hundreds of lives. And essentially what that is he used formaldehyde to inactivate the poliovirus so that it couldn't infect the cells, but they could still create those IgG antibodies as a response. A little bit later, Dr. Albert Sabin, I think in 1961, created the oral polio vaccine, and that came out afterward and was more effective because this attenuated virus still had the ability to infect humans, and it was directly in the GI tract, so that was going to stimulate an IgA antibody response, and in addition to the IgG antibody response. So OPV was typically preferable to the other vaccine, but today we use the IPV, especially in the United States, because there is a slight chance of disease developing from OPV, so it's just preferable for us. So a little bit on the epidemiology. Hey guys, sorry, my video got cut off mid-thing. But yeah, so a little bit about the epidemiology. So PV1 has been endemic, present in 2 countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan, but for the most part, PV2 and PV3 have been completely eradicated. And this has been since 1988. The Americas have been eradicated, and there's also been a resolution to completely eradicate polio, so we're really heading in the direction of total eradication. So this is a little bit of the current and past epidemiology, where we were in 1988 when that resolution was first passed, and where we are now. Also to note, in 2022, Nigeria actually hasn't had any cases as of 2022. So, okay, so then future outlook. Poliovirus is actually being used to study cancer right now, and health professionals are also continuously developing the oral polio vaccine to improve its efficacy. Overall, we can look at polio as one of humanity's greatest public health achievements, and hopefully we can look forward to more successes. Thanks for listening. Poliovirus is mainly eradicated. There are two